discussing a philosopher as if he were a puncheon of rum. His temper, they remarked, was very mild and patient, and judging from the gentleness of his deportment, and the courtesy with which he treated themselves, that he could be nothing more than some green young man, they concluded that they should have all the easier task in disposing of his life. They made no scruple to discuss the whole matter in his presence, as not supposing that he understood any other language than that in which he conversed with his servant, and the amount of their deliberation was, to murder him, then throw him into the sea and divide his spoils. Excuse my laughing, gentlemen, but the fact is I always do laugh when I think of this case. Two things about it seem so droll. One is the horrid panic, or funk, as the men of Eton call it, in which Descartes must have found himself upon hearing this regular drama sketched for his own death, funeral, succession, and administration to his effects. But another thing, which seems to me still more funny about this affair, is, that if these Friesland hounds had been game, we should have no Cartesian philosophy, and how we could have done without that, considering the world of books it has produced, I leave to any respectable trunk maker to declare. However, to go on, spite of his enormous funk, Descartes showed fight, and by that means awed these anti-Cartesian rascals. Finding, says M. Baillet, that the matter was no joke, M. Descartes leaped upon his feet in a trice, assumed a stern countenance that these cravens had never looked for, and addressing them in their own language, threatened to run them through on the spot if they dared offer him any insult. Certainly, gentlemen, this would have been an honor far above the merits of such inconsiderable rascals, to be spitted like larks upon a Cartesian sword, and therefore I am glad M. Descartes did not rob the gallows by executing his threat, especially as he could not possibly have brought his vessel to port after he had murdered his crew, so that he must have continued to cruise forever in the Zuider Zee, and would probably have been mistaken by sailors for the Flying Dutchman, homeward bound. The spirit which M. Descartes manifested, says the biographer, had the effect of magic on these wretches. The suddenness of their consternation struck their minds with a confusion which blinded them to their advantage, and they conveyed him to his destination as peaceably as he could desire. Possibly, gentlemen, you may fancy that, on the model of Caesar's address to his poor ferryman, Caesarum vius et fortune ejus, M. Descartes need only to have said, "Dogs, you cannot cut my throat, for you carry Descartes and his philosophy," and might safely have defied them to do their worst. A German emperor had the same notion, when being cautioned to keep out of the way of a cannoning, he replied, "Tut, man, did you ever hear of a cannon ball that killed an emperor?" As to an emperor, I cannot say, but a less thing has suffered to smash a philosopher, and the next great philosopher of Europe undoubtedly was murdered. This was Spinoza. I know very well the common opinion about him is that he died in his bed. Perhaps he did, but he was murdered for all that, and this I shall prove by a book published at Brussels in the year 1731, entitled La Vie de Spinoza, par M. John Sullers, with many additions from an MS life by one of his friends. Spinoza died on the 21st February, 1677, being then little more than 44 years old. This of itself looks suspicious, and M. Jean admits that a certain expression in the MS life of him would warrant the conclusion que sa mort n'a pas tout fait naturel. Living in a damp country, and a sailor's country like Holland, he may be thought to have indulged a good deal in grog, especially in punch, which was then newly discovered. Footnote: June 1, 1675. Drink part of 3 boules of punch, "a liquor very strange to me," says the Reverend Mr. Harry Cheong in his diary lately published. In a note on this passage, a reference is made to Fry's Travels in the East Indies, 1672, speaks of "that enervating liquor called punch, which is Hindostan for 5, from 5 ingredients." Made thus, it seems the medical men call it diapente, if with 4 only, diesterone. No doubt it was its evangelical name that recommended it to the Reverend Mr. Cheong. Undoubtedly, he might have done so, but the fact is that he did not. M. Jean calls him extrêmement sober en son bois et son manger. And then some wild stories were afloat about his using the juice of a mandragora and opium, yet neither of these articles appeared in his druggist bill. Living therefore with such sobriety, how was it possible that he should die a natural death at 44? Here is biographer's account: "Sunday, morning of the 21st of February, Before it was church time, Spinoza came down the stairs and conversed with the master and mistress of the house." At this time, therefore, perhaps 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, you see that Spinoza was alive and pretty well. But it seems, "he had summoned from Amsterdam a certain physician, whom," says the biographer, "I shall not otherwise point out to notice than by these 2 letters, L.M. This L.M. has directed the people of the house to purchase an ancient cock, and to have him boiled forthwith, in order that Spinoza might take some broth about noon, which in fact he did, and ate some of the old cock with good appetite, after the landlord and his wife had returned from church." "In the afternoon L.M. stayed alone with Spinoza, the people of the house having returned to church, on coming out from which they learnt with much surprise that Spinoza had died about 3 o'clock in the presence of L.M., who took his departure for Amsterdam the same evening by the night boat, without paying the least attention to the deceased. No doubt he was the readier to dispense with these duties, as he had possessed himself of a ducatoon and a small quantity of silver, together with a silver hafted knife, and had absconded with his pillage." Here you see, gentlemen, the murder is plain, and the manner of it. It was L.M. who murdered Spinoza for his money. Poor S. was an invalid, meagre and weak. As no blood was observed, L.M. no doubt threw him down and smothered him with pillows, the poor man being already half suffocated by his infernal dinner. But who was L.M.? It surely never could be Lindley Murray, for I saw him at York in 1875, and besides, I do not think he would do such a thing, at least not to a brother grammarian. For you know, gentlemen, that Spinoza wrote a very respectable Hebrew grammar. Hobbes, but why, or on what principle I never could understand, was not murdered. This was a capital oversight of the professional men in the 17th century, because in every light he was a fine subject for murder, except indeed that he was lean and skinny, for I can prove that he had money, and, what is very funny, he had no right to make the least resistance, for according to himself, irresistible power creates the very highest species of right, so that it is rebellion of the blackest eye to refuse to be murdered when a competent force appears to murder you. However, gentlemen, though he was not murdered, I am happy to assure you that by his own account he was 3 times very near being murdered. The first time was in the spring of 1640, when he pretends to have circulated a little manuscript on the king's behalf against the Parliament. He never could produce this manuscript, by the by, but he says that, "had not his Majesty dissolved the Parliament," in May, "it had brought him into danger of his life." Dissolving the Parliament, however, was of no use, for in November of the same year the Long Parliament assembled, and Hobbes, a second time, fearing he should be murdered, ran away to France. This looks like the madness of John Dennis, who thought that Louis XIV. Would never make peace with Queen Anne unless he were given up to his vengeance, and actually ran away from the sea-coast in that belief. In France, Hobbes managed to take care of his throat pretty well for 10 years, but at the end of that time, by way of paying court to Cromwell, he published his Leviathan. The old coward now began to funk horribly for the 3rd time. He fancied the swords of the Cavaliers were constantly at his throat, recalling how they had served as Parliament ambassadors and at the Hague and Madrid. "Turn," says he, in his dog-Latin life of himself, "tum venit in mentem me doricent et acham, tanquam proscripto terror ubique adorat." And accordingly he ran home to England. Now certainly it is very true that a man deserving a cudgelling for writing Leviathan, and 2 or 3 cudgellings for writing a pentameter ending so villainously as "terror ubique adorat," but no man ever thought him worthy of anything beyond cudgelling, and in fact the whole story is a bounce of his own. For in the most abusive letter which he wrote "to a learned person," meaning Wallace the mathematician, he gives quite another account of the matter, and says, page 8, he ran home "because he would not trust his safety with the French clergy," insinuating that he was likely to be murdered for his religion, which would have been a high joke indeed, Tom's being brought to the stake for religion. Bounce or not bounce, however, certain it is that Hobbes to the end of his life feared that somebody would murder him. This is proved by the story I am going to tell you. It is not from a manuscript, but, as Mr. Coleridge said, it is as good as a manuscript, for it comes from a book now entirely forgotten. That is, "The Creed of Mr. Hobbes examined in a conference between him and a student of divinity," published about 10 years before Hobbes's death. The book is anonymous, but it was written by Tennyson, the same who, about 30 years after, succeeded Tillotson as Archbishop of Canterbury. The introductory anecdote is as follows.